Welcome to the IpX True North Podcast, where we connect people, processes, and tools.
Nate, welcome back to our podcast series. I'm really looking forward to today's topic, and to our listeners, thank you for joining. If you haven't listened to any of Dr. Hartman's podcasts that we've been doing over the last few weeks now, I highly recommend you going back and taking a listen. There's a lot of good stuff talking about really the future of the industrial ecosystem, of business and organization. We've covered everything from organizational change management to operating models. And today, really looking forward into this first part, talking about the future of digital engineering and digital manufacturing. So Nate, welcome back.
Thanks, Joe. Good to be back. I'm looking forward to today's topic. I think this is going to be a pretty lively discussion.
Yeah, we haven't been talking about this for a while, have we?
No, not at all.
There was a time that we could say we were talking about this when we were younger. Those days are gone.
Right. Unfortunately for me, that's a lot of topics these days.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. As you can see by my face, I now have gray hair. But anyway, sorry for our listeners listening to us get off topic already. But hold on, this is going to be a good series. Everyone's talking about this, Nate. We know it. It's digital transformation this, digital transformation that. It's model-based engineering, model-based enterprise, model-based definition, artificial intelligence, machine learning, AR in the field. So now we've got augmented reality for field service techs. I mean, we've really are on the cusp of a lot of things, all with that big old digital word focused on it. And it's been around for a while, right? I think you and I both know, but we're not talking about CAD anymore, right? We're not. It's not the future. We've surpassed that. And I do believe a lot of companies are still trying to play catch up, quite honestly. When you talk about all these digital initiatives and platforms and ways of thinking, I think the traditional way of operating and those legacy processes, those legacy systems are really starting to kind of creep out underneath the proverbial rug, right? These things have been hidden under for so long. And I do think that's why we've heard so many people and so many organizations talk about digital transformation. And it's gotten a little watered down, but the reality is these companies, it's time. And you can't just buy a new tool and have those legacy processes and those other legacy tools and systems try to be interoperable. It's just not going to work. So I'm looking forward to today's topic. We'll start high level, and I really want to dig in, into the artificial intelligence and machine learning, what that means from data, with blockchain and an understanding of that, and I think there's a lot of people are scared by these words and these terms, but at the end of the day, to break it down, it's something you and I have discussed. It's at its finest, broken down element. We're talking about data interoperability and data connection and processes and tools that support that in a much more robust way, a much more efficient and effective way. So looking forward to this. And let's just for a few minutes, what's your view on where we're headed with all these things digital?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Joe. It's one sometimes that I get asked often, sometimes by my students, sometimes by other colleagues, sometimes people in industry. I think you said a couple key things in there. One is some of the technologies that we're talking about are not necessarily new. I often talk about 3D printing, for example, or in general additive manufacturing. That's not necessarily a new technology, yet everybody and their brother seems to be enamored by it. And in my mind, I think some of the reasons are that, the additive world used to be confined to, university or industry research labs. It used to be confined to people who just wanted to be able to visualize whether that part on their screen was actually going to look the way it looked on their screen. you might be able to do a little bit of fit and form things with it over the years, but it wasn't necessarily functional, right? In terms of the fit, form, and function. And so yet, fast forward to kind of where we are today, additive, like I said, additive manufacturing has been around for, almost 40 years. And so, and people who do welding would say they've been doing additive manufacturing for a lot longer. So, my point being is that I think what has changed, and I think this is true of a lot of our digital technologies these days, is that the barrier for entry on using them has become quite low, relatively speaking, of course. I think when you look at additive in particular, materials have become much better. The machines have become more reliable. They've also become cheaper. They've become smaller. It's become a little bit more streamlined in terms of going from, say, a 3D model to a 3D printed part. There's less sort of magic that needs to happen. There's still some, but it's not as much as it was. I think another thing is that the kinds of design and optimization tools that we have, that create these topologies that are, to some degree no longer restricted by, our manufacturing capability that was, mills and lathes, or that is casting or forging, or that is molding of various sorts, right? It's, for better or for worse, those were our technologies for a long, long time, but yet there were certain design constraints, certain geometries that couldn't be achieved very easily because of the nature of the process. Well, with additive, some of those restrictions go away. Now, sometimes that creates new restrictions, but my point being is that to some degree, I think what we're seeing here is just as much of a social phenomenon or business phenomenon as it is any sort of technological evolution. Again, if you look at digital transformation, to your point, people use that word a lot. And to be fair, digital transformation in and of itself doesn't necessarily have exclusivity to manufacturing. I mean, digital transformation is in the healthcare sector. It's in the IT sector. It's in the energy sector. It's in the, public utility sectors. It's in, fashion. It's in a lot of places. And so digital transformation in and of itself is not necessarily the same as digital manufacturing or digital engineering. It's not necessarily the same as the fourth industrial revolution or Industry 4.0, which technically that and the fourth industrial revolution are somewhat different things. And so I say that really to emphasize 2 points. One is that we're seeing just as much of a social phenomenon, I think, as we are a technological one. And secondly, words and labels matter. And these words and labels have certain connotations to people, yet it's hard in many cases to get agreement, even amongst people who are rather like-minded from the same community within the industry. It's hard to get an agreement even sometimes from them about what some of these terms mean. And so I think that has been one of the challenging things for companies trying to adopt, whether it be the methods or the tools. So where do I start? Someone told me that someone told me that I should be doing Industry 4.0, right? Well, what does that mean? And the way I do Industry 4.0 may be very different than the way you do Industry 4.0. And so I think we end up in a situation where I think companies, again, I'll go back to some of the things we said before in some of our previous episodes, has been, companies really need to take a step back and think about what are the technical elements of this, and then what are the sort of social structure, corporate structure elements of this, and how do each one affect their way of doing business?
And I'd like to dissect that a little bit. And you raise a really good point that very few people actually discuss, which is the difference between the fourth industrial revolution and Industry 4.0. And what I'd like to know is your thoughts based off a little bit of, my perspective, where a lot of companies aren't really utilizing the data they have. So we now live in a world, as we all know, it's very consumer focused and data rich from that environment. So once we have a product in the field or a service in the field, you have rapid response, real-time response almost on the product that you release into the consumers. And that could be good or bad. And it could be a middle. It could be a little bit of a gray area, actually. So if we release a product and we release a product with a quality escape, we all know how that can go. If you don't have a lifestyle brand, it could ruin your brand. Larger companies, as we all know, sometimes they factor that into their warranty costs, unfortunately. But what I see as a major opportunity is for these organizations to take that consumer data and structure it, cleanse it, and feed that back into product development. And I think that's an area where a lot of companies are missing the mark. And to me, that is a very, very important part of what Industry 4.0 could be to an automotive manufacturer or fashion or high tech. But I would like, your perspective and for you to dissect that a little bit more. What does Industry 4.0 mean in relation to the consumer as well? When we're talking about manufacturing and design.
Yeah. Well, I think, Joe, for people that I'll start off by saying this. I think for people who are the same age or similar ages as you and I, we've lived through part of our career that was the non-digital world, right? In as much as my kids make fun of me, right, about having, been around when the internet was created, for them, they don't know any different in terms of the fact that there is an internet, or that there was a time when there was not an internet or a World Wide Web or what have you. So I think there's that phenomenon where there are folks like us still in the workforce who knew life before a mobile phone with a bunch of apps on it, for example. Yet, even my parents, who are, almost 80 years old, have figured out how to use Uber. Why, or how? Well, because it presents, and I'm going to oversimplify this, and hopefully, no one from that company takes offense to this, but, if you, prior to that, you could walk through a big city and hail a taxi. Yet I don't necessarily need to do that today. And so, I can, but I don't necessarily have to. Well, why? Because, someone has now, or a company has now put available transportation capacity literally at my fingertips. And it's not because we just created cars yesterday, right? That's not the power of Uber. And you can say the same thing about Amazon, or you can say the same thing about these organizations that have built a business model on aggregating capacity and aggregating information, and then putting that at literally the fingertips of the user for what they want. And then, so I'll come back to my age comment for a minute. People who are my children's age, and so I have 3 teenagers, right? And they just expect this to work. Whereas you and I understand literally what the word bug meant in terms of software development, right? You and I understood when, the proverbial blue screen of death popped up on your PC, what that means. And
it still happens, by the way. I've been
dealing
with
absolutely. Here's another one, and I don't know, maybe it's just my kids are stupid, but the point is that, my kids honestly don't tell the difference between our Wi-Fi home network and the cellular telephone network. And, we could be driving along somewhere in the car, and I don't know, maybe this is just a testament to bad parenting, but, they'll have their phone with them, right? And they're all of age now where they actually have a telephone. It's not just essentially a glorified iPod. It's an actual telephone. And if we run into a place where there's no service, or very not so good service, they all get twitchy, right? It's like they haven't had their morning caffeine because they can't connect to the network. Yet, if something happens, for example, let's say our internet service at home goes out because of a storm or something like that, They don't differentiate between Wi-Fi and cellular service.
Right.
So here's my point, and the reason why I'm bringing all this up is that there's a certain ubiquitousness to this technology that people of a certain age just simply expect, and they expect it to work the first time out. Whereas people like you and I, we knew it at a time when it didn't work the first time out.
Right.
Hell, it might not work the second or third time out.
Right.
And so you have to navigate through that. But yet one of the reasons why I think this could be sort of a beneficial thing to capitalize on for companies, to your point about interoperability through the life cycle, is information comes to people in different forms. And, I'll be honest with you, there are times, again, I'm going to use my kids as an example, where they're perfectly fine navigating whatever it is they're doing on their phone. I suppose I could do it that way, but I'm actually more comfortable pulling up my laptop.
Yeah.
Because there's a certain amount of spatial awareness or situational awareness, or maybe it's just a placebo that laptop gives me that, arguably my phone doesn't, but they're used to that, right?
Yeah.
And I'm used to a much more mixed metaphor, if you will. And so to me, that is relevant here because, organizations as ecosystems are mixtures of data. We've all heard the debates of structured versus unstructured, right? Live versus archived, or, three-dimensional versus two-dimensional, so on and so forth, right? I mean, you can break it down in a number of different ways, but the idea is that, it's full of different forms of data. And one of the challenges we have from an interoperability perspective, and what sometimes negates the promise, if you will, of digital transformation or the potential of, say, Industry 4.0, is that it's very hard still today to combine into some kind of singular presentation, some sort of singular model, for lack of a better word. And I don't necessarily mean CAD model there. I just mean model in the more general sense. It's hard to combine disparate data forms into one sort of presentation, if you will, so that it can be consumed, especially considering that in many cases up front in the life cycle, things tend to be geometrical or textual. Things in the middle of the life cycle tend to be numerical. Numerical.
I think this is
right. And at the end of the life cycle, they tend to be textual, and in some cases, I'm just going to say graphical, right? Not geometrical, but graphical, right? And so you have these mixed modes of information that don't readily go together. And so when we talk about digital transformation within an organization, this changing ecosystem of digital engineering and manufacturing, we also have to talk about, well, digital use, right? In situ use by the customer. We have to talk about digital sustainment, or MRO and sustainment, depending on what industry sector you're in. And the idea, though, is that these disparate forms, it's hard to connect them. It's hard to get, end of life cycle or near end of life cycle information into a form that can be fed back into requirements definition, for example. So I think your point about interoperability, or maybe the lack of it, is one of the important factors in this conversation.
Yeah, and I'm pausing here because there's a few ways we could go with this. When you're talking about, you mentioned, the aggregation of information and the digital use of this information. I think this is where, on a consumer base, I think if you're somewhat observant, and depending on the settings you have on your phone, we all know now, depending on, what site you go, what you purchase, or what location you go, you get really dedicated ads, right?
Right.
And that's just, there's some intelligence there going on. And I think I want to try to transition a little bit towards the artificial intelligence word. And this always makes me smile, because we're, in my opinion, we're so far beyond artificial, and there's a learning curve here. And I think a lot of companies are trying, and individually, there's some great visionaries out there. We work with some of them at IpX, but my perspective on artificial intelligence, it's more action-based intelligence, which is robotics, right? Been around for decades, and you've got more adaptive based now, where you have intelligence built in, where you have what we call autonomous cars or vehicles or transportation, but they're not truly autonomous yet. They're getting there, but there's still some manual intervention. But I think regardless of what industry you're in, there should be a focus on how are we going to use intelligence, and that's what you were mentioning. And from your perspective, how does that relate to this big bow wave of momentum for the artificial intelligence world and the machine learning world, and what's that mean from the the industry 4.0, for me as an individual, for me as a consumer, but also for your larger manufacturing facilities? And the one thing I want to add on to this, I always do this to you, Nate, I'm sorry. From the U.S. perspective, we're seeing a shift and a focus and an evolution, and we're starting to see an investment in manufacturing come back within the U.S. And I think we're seeing that across a lot of countries because of where we're at with technology and with all of these shifts and the evolution of all of this capability. So you've got artificial intelligence, you have machine learning, we have advanced manufacturing, and now we've got all this stuff being thrown at us from a consumer and from an OEM. What's that mean? Where do you see the wave of change leading us?
There's a lot to unpack right there. So let me.
I told you I do this to you. You're not.
Yeah,
this isn't new.
It's sometimes I think people might watch our episodes looking for some lively banter back and forth, but we're not shy about 4 or 5 minute monologues either. So let me see what I can do with that one. I think some of it kind of begs the question to me is.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
I forgot. This is a little bit of banter. Nate does not believe his children are stupid, but we're not going to edit that part out. So I just want to, in case Nate's children are bored and decide to listen to Dad pontificate with Joseph Anderson.
Right.
That was a joke. So,
but but it was only partly a joke, and I say that
you're on your own now. I said you're on your own now.
Yeah, I know. I'm just going to keep digging the hole. It gets deeper, but hopefully my wife doesn't see this. And but my point is that to some degree it was only a little bit or partly a joke, because really what I'm talking about, I think this relates a little bit to the question you just asked me to expound on is it comes down to some degree frames of reference. My 3 kids, their frame of reference for technology was different than mine, right? My age group has seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of how some of these things don't work, right? Whereas my kids, and even, I'll think about also to some degree my nieces and nephews who are younger than them, this stuff is just there, right? There's never a time when it wasn't there. Now, as parents, you might meter out how your child interacts with that stuff, but it's still there.
Right.
So I'm going to now jump over to kind of your question of this idea of intelligence, right? And I think I don't want to be too pedantic about vocabulary, but I think it's a situation where artificial intelligence and machine learning are not necessarily the same thing. Some people will say they're 2 completely different things. Some people will say that one is a subset of the other. I'm not going to get into that level of an argument. I'm just simply going to say they're not exactly the same thing,
right?
At least in my opinion. I think we are a long, long way yet from some sort of ubiquitous, generalized artificial intelligence, right? Where, if you think about the Marvel movies where, Tony Stark has Jarvis, right? We're a long way from Jarvis,
Right.
in my view. I'm sure there might be some secret government program somewhere that has Jarvis, right? But for the general public, we're a little ways yet from Jarvis. Okay. That being said, though, I think we're right in the midst of being able to leverage machine learning. The challenge, I think, with machine learning is, at least the way the technology is today, it generally relies on some sort of training that you do to the algorithm, so that your algorithm can recognize whether it's quality or reject, whether it's good or bad, whether it's green or red, whatever the decision is you want it to make. You generally have to train it somehow. Now, there's all kinds of academic literature about how you can train it, and it gets you into the math and the computer science of it all. Again, that's not necessarily where we're going today in this conversation, but I think one of the key words right there is decision. What we're really talking about in a lot of cases is automation of decision making, or at least support for decision making. And while, the carbon-based life form in the ecosystem, right, i.e. humans, we can cipher a lot, with the human supercomputer, but, we do have limits, right? Humans get tired, humans get bored. Humans may have physical impairments or mental impairments that cause them to not necessarily make good decisions, and I'm not necessarily talking about life decisions. What I'm talking about is, in the context of a work environment, a manufacturing operation, right, where somebody's got to make a decision about, does this part or this product or whatever pass inspection, for example. We've come up with a lot of clever ways over the years to determine whether parts meet spec. One of the very simplest of things, right, was go, no-go gauges, right?
Right.
Slide the part in. If it fits, it goes. If not, it doesn't go. Now, it arguably, and to be fair, from a work performance study perspective, you've just simplified a great deal of decision making down to, okay, does the widget fit in the gauge? Yes or no? Most people can figure out yes or no. And so what we're talking about now is this automation of decision making. Previous industrial revolutions automated physical labor.
Yep.
Now we're talking about automating human cognition or human decision-making capability.
And, that goes back to what, I always use the word, it becomes adaptive, right? From an automation perspective.
Yeah, because again, Joe, I think we're not talking about this generalized intelligence. We're often talking about this algorithmic-based decision support tool that's very specific to a particular context. And so, at least in the manufacturing scenario, or in maybe the Industry 4.0 scenario, what we can do is we can employ machine learning in a number of places where humans might need assistance. We don't want to take a human completely out of the loop. We still need, whether it's emotional intelligence or whether it's domain-specific expertise, we still need that to be there. But what we want to ease is the cognitive load that happens in an environment like this, where maybe we're presented with too many competing options. And so it overwhelms our ability to process that. And so if we can maybe have the machine learning algorithm take a bit of pre-processing, if you will, and only present us, say, 3 choices instead of 27, then, I think most people would agree that machine learning algorithm has done its job and is effective. And especially if we can bring our reject rates down, or our quality escapes down, or conversely make our good quality numbers go up, regardless of how you think of it. To me, it's what we're really seeing here is, I think, another form of automation. But rather than automating physical labor or automating, mechanical operations, if you will, we're now automating decision making and cognition.
Yeah, and I'm right there with you. I think it's one area that we're big proponents on, from my seat in this world, which is there's a lot of investment on the automation of the design and manufacturing thought process, validation, verification. There's a lot of tools out there. The one area that I still struggle, and it's honestly a pet peeve, and I could use a lot of expletives for it, because I do believe it's why we have so many quality escapes to this day, is there's a need for an investment to tie in that type of capability on the requirement side, on the regulatory requirements, environmental, consumer. All of that can be more automated and more adaptive. And that's one area that I feel like a lot of companies, when we use that big digital transformation bucket, our marketing term buzzword, that's the one where I'm, really pushing, the C-suite and going, listen, it's absolutely. You got to invest in these technologies and these process changes here, but we also can't just keep manually checking our requirements to our product, our design, and our manufacturing. And we have to have more intelligence there on that administrative side, right? The administrative hierarchy or your business process hierarchy, that should be automated as well, or more adaptive. And there should be, and I think it's just much like you were talking about. A lot of these companies, these large corporations, have grown through acquisition.
Yeah.
And what they've purchased is a product and tools. And then they say, eventually we'll get to the processes. Eventually we'll get to the requirements, and they never do, and this compounds. And as they grow, now they look back and go, oh crap.
Yeah.
And for me, this is it is a competitive advantage if companies invest in not only the tools for advanced design, advanced manufacturing, and all of that. And to me, that's the easy part.
But also more advanced quality and advanced compliance. And exactly. I think, I would say two things to that. One is, in that growth by acquisition mode, people tie themselves in knots trying to document process, right? We process ourselves to death. And yet you can go into any company, pick one, it doesn't matter. And there's process and there's practice. There's what we're supposed to do, and then there's what we actually do. Exactly. And it's, maybe this is our state of affairs about auditing, but, I can write down from a process perspective what I say that I do. And this can be the most messed up thing in the world. But as long as I follow that, I'm going to pass my audit. Now, that's a discussion for a different day. But my point is we don't often tie ourselves in knots around practice. And in my mind, if there's anything worth tying yourself in knots over in that conversation, it's more about practice than it is about process. Ultimately, I think most people would want their practice probably to really be reflected in their process, and vice versa. But I'm not really sure why. It seems to work out just the opposite of that. That's one thing I would say. The other thing I would say, going back to your point about quality escapes, is that I wonder whether it might actually be time to flip the script on quality. So many times it's presented as this punitive thing, right? We're only going to allow, 3 defects per million, or whatever the acceptable statistical rate is.
Right.
And yet we found 10 of those this shift. Oh my God, we found 10. Actually, I'd be happy that you found 10. Not so much happy that you had 10, but happy that you found them.
Right.
And so sometimes I think we find them through happenstance and dumb luck. It's not like somebody had an effective way to find them. And I think, we turn quality into this punitive activity. We turn quality into this sort of negative, if you will, because it's compared to perfection. Yeah. Think about any of the statistical process control, or just statistics in general, kinds of courses you've ever had, right? Is that they, at least in the manufacturing context, everything is always some deviation off of the theoretical perfect and true. And, we categorize it as everything from tool wear to human error to variation in the material, right?
Right.
Well, yes, those are physical phenomena that we just can't get around. but yet we always seem to cast it in the negative. And I wonder if maybe, and again, this is sort of a, the emotional intelligence bit of organizational leadership, but if we cast it in something that, I don't know if positive is the right word, or maybe just not negative, but and frame it in a way that, look, this is an ethical thing, this is a quality thing, this is a cost thing, this is a reputation thing, right? And we want all of those things to be good, right, about our organization.
Yeah.
Yet how many times have people been penalized for finding quality escapes, right?
Right.
Or some engineering manager or production manager dials down and says, forget it, we'll make it up on warranty because the truck's coming in 3 hours, and if we don't make the truck, then there's all this other ripple effect. Well, does that ripple effect add up to more than making it up on warranty?
Right. Yeah, and God forbid your quality escape causes a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit, right?
Yeah, that's generally a bad thing. Yeah.
And for me, it's that's an interesting thing you brought up, Nate. And I think it'd be a major shift, a major change in mindset, because you're right. Quality has become this punitive, necessary evil, so to speak. And I do think it's something that we need to bring back to the game, because we have products in the field now that are, I don't know if consumers realize that I'm stumbling upon my words here, but as consumers now, the majority of the products we purchase, we're signing up for those products to be changed live in the field. Embedded software is here, live updates for our phones, our computers, our vehicles, any mode of transportation you have built within the last 5 years can be updated. And it probably is being updated, whether you know it or not. And, there's examples of, Tesla's one where they have beta programs, where you could sign up for the beta program of that fielded unit. Yeah. And this is a whole new world. And it's, to bookend, how we started, how quickly things have changed in the last 10 years, let alone 20. We now, as consumers, are accepting that our products can be changed by the manufacturer, by the producer. And that's an interesting game. I think, we've all signed contracts here, sign on this line and we'll get going, without reading it. Unfortunately, in the past, I'm guilty of that. We do it now with our phones, with our apps, with our computers, even with the vehicles we purchase. There's a lot of small font there on what that means.
I agree, because we want that window to go away.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's a lot there. And I think, we now as consumers we become quality inspectors. And, I think it ties back into what I was saying about the use of that consumer information into product development. And also what you just discussed, which is we've got to change the way we view our quality competency.
I'd also say, if variation in any kind of a process is this known and generally accepted phenomenon, to me, I think we would always want to see whether or not we can put bounds on our variation, right? We've all talked about in a traditional machining sense, right? Acceptable variation, and companies do the math and they figure out, okay, we can allow for, 8% scrap or whatever the rate is, right? And so if variation is something, literally that we cannot prevent, right? It's more than likely, I suppose, while maybe it's statistically possible to have zero variation, it's not very likely. And so, so knowing the practical realities of trying to put it to zero, why not design a process from the beginning that allows for a certain level and put those feedback loops, put those breakdown and inspection loops, put those rework, for lack of a better word, loops into place because you all, I mean, you know as well as I do that just because something does not meet whatever our spec is, does not necessarily mean it automatically goes into the trash bin, right? I mean,
Right.
reworking, rebuilding, fixing, before it leaves the factory is an option. And while most manufacturing firms have these kinds of functions in their, in their facilities or within their ecosystem, in many cases, again, it's seen more as a punitive afterthought rather than something we know is going to happen. So let's deal with it much farther forward in, say, the production phase of the life cycle, whatever that means to someone, than waiting until the end.
There's a lot here, my friend. It's like we were discussing, I think before we actually started recording, this could be a 10-part series just on this topic.
Yeah.
And what I want to do before we close this one down is, and we'll be back next week, continuing digital engineering and digital manufacturing. And honestly, it's a digital ecosystem. So much more. I do want to, it's opportunity, and I hope our listeners realize this is, in some of these monologues, there is a lot here, and it's not easy just to banter. If you want to make tangible, tactical improvement, there's a lot here, regardless of the size of your company. You have to have people actually discussing this, thoughtfully. And getting these things written down and having a strategy, a roadmap, a blueprint, whatever you want to call it, because it's here and you just can't be inflexible. Again, this is just the perspective of just some goofball named Joe Anderson. But at the time of being inflexible and just investing in the next software tool, those eventually you're gonna close up shop. And
I would agree with you. I mean, I can think of some other projects that we have going here at the university where we talk about what does a next generation workforce who's going to work in an ecosystem like this, what does that look like? What are their knowledge, or what are their knowledge points? What are their various personal dispositions? What are their, attitudes that go along with being able to do these things? And, the industry today talks a lot about upskilling and reskilling, to your point. And, I guess I'm not necessarily sold on the word upskilling because it sounds like, someone else is less than, but reskilling for sure. Yeah. And, the fact that somebody may in fact have to reskill more than once.
Yeah.
More than 5 times, And so what is it about certain people who work in certain environments where they have a disposition towards being able to reskill, and then others who, don't, and whether it's maybe it just takes them longer, or maybe they're one of those people, we've all seen them, who sort of actively fights the change.
Right.
It's important, I think, for organizations to think about this, particularly from an ecosystem perspective. Because ecosystem implies that the various actors in the ecosystem, there's some amount of symbiosis there, right? There's some amount of give and take in some state of equilibrium in that ecosystem.
And I think you're touching on it. It's continual development, for that or reskilling, as you were discussing. But companies do need to have a investment there, because if I hired someone 15 years ago to do let's just say a drafting job, that skill set's changed rapidly, even in the last few years on the systems, the tools, the capability that's out there now. So I think there is that need, that investment for that continual development. I've pontificated before on the difference between continuous and continual. Continual is a focus on improving, but monitoring as well, assessing. That means we're not just throwing money at it. We are strategically investing in continual development of our workforce. And I think we need to do that with our higher ed partners as well. Mm-hmm. we're gonna get into that next week, Nate, as well. I also want to talk, for our listeners next week. We're going to be talking about what AR means to the industry now, right? And what automation on the factory floor, automation and AR in field and service, integrated logistics. I mean, there's a lot here that Nate and I are going to be talking about. But for this one, Nate, I just want to say thank you again for joining us today. It's always a pleasure, man. I hope our listeners appreciate everything we're talking about. And as you know, Nate, and I'm going to speak for you here. We're typically available for these discussions, to our network, and we don't shy away from trying to help someone out. So thanks again, Nate, for joining us. I look forward to talking to you next week.
Yeah, thank you again, Joe, for having me. And as always, I appreciate the lively discussion. And as you said, folks know how to find us. We're not invisible. We're not hiding out anywhere. So if, I know that these links to some of these things will be put out via social media and other channels, feel free to comment. Feel free to engage us there or in some other way. So, but again, looking forward to next time. And again, thanks as always.
Absolutely.
Thank you for tuning in today. Don't forget to subscribe and review the show. And for more information on IpX, visit ipxhq.com.